This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.
A fiddler on the roof. Sounds crazy, no? But here, in our little village of Anatevka, you might say every one of us is a fiddler on the roof.
It's unholy, so much news to talk about, but all I really want to dive into is the life of Chaim Topol, the definitive Tevye, whose death was announced this week. I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv. It's Unholy, Two Jews on the News from Keshet Podcast, and indeed, as you mentioned, Jonathan, a lot of other news going on. But first, we want to say to life and to talk about Chaim Topol. It's interesting to me, like the first thing that you think about really is that there is one role that you can see him in. He did many other roles, and Israelis obviously remember him as Salach Shabbat, so many others. I mean, he's really the definitive Israeli actor. And we should say that the theme that we heard, not only Chaim Topol, but this is a way that a radio show that went on for, to remind me, 20 or 25 years, which was presented by Michael Friedland, your father, and a program called You Don't Have to Be Jewish. That was its opening theme.
This is all working for me on so many different emotional levels. It's quite true, because how we opened our show this week, slightly you indulging me, triggers a very Proustian, nostalgic memory for me, because absolutely those opening notes of Fiddler on the Roof were also the opening notes for 25 years of You Don't Have to Be Jewish on the BBC, presented by my late dad, Michael Friedland. And so when I sit in the theatre seeing revivals of Fiddler on the Roof, I'm being hit emotionally from all directions, because yes, it's the story, but also it's this absolute memory woven in throughout my life, because the radio show started when I was 4 years old. But let's talk about Topol himself and this show. The two are so interwoven themselves, Topol and Tevye, to the point where people would sometimes say, "Oh, are you playing Topol?" As if Topol was the character. On the BBC this morning, as you and I are recording, because the news of the death came through overnight for Thursday, the BBC did a tribute, and they got on an actor, Andy Nyman, very good actor, who played Tevye recently, to pay tribute to Topol. And what was so fascinating was he and the anchor of the show just started talking about the character of Tevye and saying he's such a strong role model, a proud father, but he cares so much, and any immigrant family. And before you knew it, the two had merged into each other. And that was, in a way, Topol's fate, is that he played this character so definitively, brilliantly, initially in the Hebrew production, and was seen by the producers of the Broadway show, who just thought, this guy is great. He was very, very young, just 30 years old, I think, when he first played this middle-aged father with adult children, worrying about his three daughters and their marital choices. And he swept them off their feet, and it got cast against all expectation in the Hollywood movie. The role until then had belonged to Zero Mostel, but it became Topol's. But in some ways he could never escape it. And I've mentioned my dad. I mean, my dad did work with Topol a lot. He was a frequent guest on the radio show, and would ask him this thing, does it, irritate you? And I think the truth is, on some level it did. He wanted to have a bigger role. Publicly, he would have more roles. Publicly, he would always say that, no, I'm so grateful just to have this one thing. But it could be an irritation, but the two became absolutely inseparable. And the place of Fiddler on the Roof, I think, for diaspora Jews in particular, cannot be overstated. There are many Jews whose whole knowledge of shtetl life, of life before their families came to Britain or America or whatever, is from that show. I mean, that's their understanding of what the shtetl is. Anatevka is the definitive shtetl in the kind of global imagination. I mean, that is a huge achievement, and centrally down to Chaim Topol, I would say.
Right. And the effect of it, when you think of Lin-Manuel Miranda, who is such a fan of Fiddler on the Roof and of Topol himself, I think he's in the midst of making a remake of Fiddler on the Roof. He sang on his wedding day, L'chaim, to life, with his father-in-law. I mean, just think of how, in the history of musicals, just how important that was.
I mean, the strange thing about the show, Fiddler on the Roof, is you didn't have to be Jewish to love it. Right. And it is so unabashedly without compromise in its Jewishness. And yet it is completely seen as a universal story. But now we're going to have to see that show without even Topol as a sort of living part of our imagination, although I think perhaps it will always be there because of the film. We'll always have that in our minds. If I Were a Rich Man, incidentally, is the bit that everyone's been playing as part of the sort of, broadcast obituaries of Topol. It's typical of me, isn't it? But I had to have sort of angst about that. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things that's really understood. If you know the canon of Sholem Aleichem and Isaac Bashevis Singer and so on, you know that it's the dream of a very obviously poor man coming from a poor world. There are people who I think, oh, right, of course, it's Jews that all they're dreaming about is money. Yeah. And so I prefer myself to hear, again, the song Tradition or Sunrise, Sunset, or, with that opening line, is this the little girl I carried? I mean, it is so moving. I have to say, my father did at the wedding of my older sister Fiona, he did literally start breaking out into song and sing "Is This the Little Girl I Carried" in his wedding speech. A moment of huge embarrassment at the time, but a fond memory now. But just more proof that somehow another, this show, Chaim Topol, woven into our lives.
It's the soundtrack of our lives.
And it's not just us. It is. It is. Now, much news going on.
And that's that. We can end our program with that and just
people would love it. But the week of Purim, we're doing everything a little bit differently, even including opening a show in a very different way from normal. The news doesn't stop, especially where you are.
No, it really doesn't. We are recording this Thursday noon, and the day of disruption and resistance, yet another one. The protest organizers call it this way. We should say that the protests in Israel have been ongoing for 9 weeks now, since Yariv Levin, the justice minister, presented his plan for judicial overhaul. Last Saturday night, there were 250,000 protesters in Israel, 160,000 of them in Tel Aviv alone. Now, the days of resistance are like the extra protest days, or when some of the protest says we're not going to be Mr. Nice Guys, we're going to block streets and do things like that. This resistance will be focused on the Ben Gurion airport, because Benjamin Netanyahu is about to take off to Rome, and demonstrators are trying to prevent that from happening. And it's definitely not a good look for him that for weeks, El Al, the national carrier, could not find a pilot that agreed to fly Netanyahu and his wife to Rome. The excuse was, of course, we couldn't find a shift for it. I'm too busy, etc. But they couldn't find a pilot who would fly them to Rome. All this, not the makings of a leader in control. If you can't drive from Jerusalem to the airport, you need to be taken by a helicopter to Ben Gurion Airport. If you cannot meet the Secretary of Defense of the United States, Lloyd Austin, who's come to see you in Jerusalem because he can't get out of the airport, so he's going to meet him there. This is all, things are not exactly normal, I think is what I'm trying to say in Israel. Now, I'm going to take a little bit of a risk here and make a little bit of a prediction, if you're ready for it.
You've got a good track record, so you can do it.
Yeah, so let's ruin it. I don't see a way in which the legislation of the judicial overhaul presented by Yariv Levin, shepherded through Parliament hurriedly by Simcha Rotman, who's the head of the Constitution Committee, I don't see how this legislation passes as it has been written. And I will explain why. I mean, maybe there's a softer version. Maybe the whole thing halts for a while. I just don't see it happening. And I will explain, because I think there are two things that happened, two very dramatic things that happened this week that changed the course of what we're seeing. The first thing that happened, and I'll just read you the headline that came out in Haaretz by Amos Harel yesterday. It said this: reservists warned the IDF chief of staff, majority of air crews in the Israeli Air Force will stop flying if Netanyahu's judicial overhaul is passed. Now, let's think about this for a minute, Jonathan, what we just heard and what Netanyahu is hearing loud and clear. We talked about this a little bit last week with Amos Yadlin, who's deputy commander of the Israeli Air Force, about Squadron 69 that said that the reservists had said they would not come to battle. And we discussed this option.
Really significant. We both said at the time, and he said, hugely significant.
I must say that I know if siren will go up and there will be an external war, they all come. But they are using their position in the Israeli society to say something. Do I love it? No. I think that as much as we can keep the IDF off this political combat, it is very important.
Let's talk about what Israel's been doing in the past decade, right? It's been called in Israel, Hamaracha ben Hamarachot. In English, it would be the war between the wars. There's been a stealth war or stealth combats. And Israel's been week in, week out, we should say, according to foreign reports, attacking Iranian targets in Syria and beyond. The, of course, reason for this is to minimize Iran's influence in the region. Now, you have to know that every time the planes are in the air doing these sorts of attacks, half of the pilots in the cockpits are reserve pilots, are reservists. If they say to Benjamin Netanyahu, we are not showing up if you run through this legislation, that is a dramatic shift in the way that he can run this.
Well, we've been asking since this began, you mentioned 9 weeks of protest, since the judicial overhaul became the story, often it's taken the form of me asking you, putting you on the spot, well, what's the thing that stops this? And there have been different pressure points throughout. There have been the tech billionaires, the unicorn founders saying, we're pulling out, taking our tax revenues with us. There's been pressure from the diaspora, American Jews in particular, statements from unexpected quarters, AIPAC, from the founder of the Anti-Defamation League, Abraham Foxman. Would that be the shoe that would drop? The protests themselves, 300,000 people sometimes on the streets. But the military, the idea of the pilots, the saying, this becomes then a national security issue. And this is what Amos Yadlin was saying, that actually Israel's own military ability to defend itself is deleteriously affected by judicial overhaul. If that argument presses in on the government, does it say, okay, in the balance of the need to reform the judiciary as they see it versus the demand that we protect the country, if those two things are in conflict, you would think that obviously the need to defend the country comes first. If we were talking about wholly rational decision making, that would obviously be the outcome. Mm-hmm. And so I'm, heartened to hear you predict that this may not happen. But my question would be whether or not that is the condition of the decision makers and the decision making. Is it wholly rational? And is it wholly putting the national interest first? Because the critique I and others have made of Netanyahu is he has got to that point. It happens often to leaders who've been in it for a very long time, where he, in his mind, fuses the national interest with his personal interest. Mm-hmm. And what is in his personal interest, he thinks is what serves the state. And in this case, getting off the hook of those trials and the prospect of jail, which is perhaps a driver for these judicial reforms when all is said and done, maybe that matters to him more even than the ability of the country to defend itself. But I ask it as a question because obviously it's in some ways an allegation, a serious one to make against him.
The leader of the state of Israel on Thursday, today, cannot drive from Jerusalem to Ben Gurion Airport to leave for Rome. He needs a helicopter to take him from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, to Ben Gurion Airport in Lod, to fly out. Even if you are his opponent and think that the one thing he's looking at is getting out of trial, the trial can run for another 2 or 2.5 years. His reign is now. And this is a man who sold this to the Israeli public and did it successfully, immensely successfully. He said, I missed your stability, I missed your security, and I missed your economy. What we're seeing is not stable. I think we can all agree on that, being Netanyahu supporters or his opponents. Security, you have a very big issue with not only pilots, but thousands of elite unit reservists saying, we're not showing up for reserve duty if you run this legislation through the Knesset. And economy, remember, we are sitting here in a week in which the credit ratings agency Moody's issues an unusual warning to Israel. If the judicial overhaul will be implemented, they say in full, the proposed changes could, I quote, materially weaken the strength of the judiciary and as such be credit negative. So he's not exactly emerging as Mr. Economy either. Now, all of this together is a perfect storm. It's stronger than Netanyahu thought it would be. It's stronger than his legislation. It's stronger than Netanyahu himself. I mean, you always ask me this perennial question throughout our past episodes. How much do the protests matter? Well, they matter because it's all a net. I'm not sure the pilots, the Israeli Air Force pilots, would feel confident to come out against the reform the way that they did if they hadn't had the support of the people in the streets. 250,000 Israelis is more than 2.5% of the population here. In American terms, that's 8.5 million people out in the streets. So it's all connected. All of it together creates this situation in which Netanyahu is stuck. I don't yet know how he turns this around, but he cannot move forward.
Such a good point about the protests, in a way, granting this permission, opening the space for other people to then act. I think it's a really valuable take because some people have been wondering what actually is the point of these demonstrations. I'm hearing that even here. By the way, there are satellite demonstrations going on around the world. In the United States, there's a big demonstration planned here in London on Sunday in Parliament Square. Very, very rare. Organised by Israelis in the UK, not organised by the British Jewish community, but organised by expat Israelis protesting against their own government. I mean, really unusual. I don't know whether that's ever happened before. And people have been wondering, what's the point? We wave a few banners and does anybody notice? And I think you've just really put your finger on an important point, which is it opens up space for others. If you are right that the government and Netanyahu himself have come to that conclusion, I think then the focus, especially actually for those people who want these reforms to be halted, is perhaps to start thinking about how he climbs down from this. Do people who want this to be averted now have to devote their energies to finding the ladder that Bibi Netanyahu can climb down, and without perhaps losing face? And that might be hard for people who would love to see him humiliated. But actually, if your focus is making sure this doesn't go ahead, what's the exit strategy? What's the way out? And I know that the president, Isaac Herzog, has offered himself as this sort of mediator and saying, let me broker some kind of compromise. I was very struck by the words of Yuval Noah Harari, previous guest on this podcast, obviously world famous historian and writer, who addressed the demonstrators last weekend, and said, on the business of compromise, when a tiger comes to devour us, we cannot negotiate a compromise whereby the tiger will only eat half of our body. And I sort of have sympathy for this. I'm somebody who, in all kinds of other arenas, does believe in negotiation and compromise. You've got to. But this is one of those difficult things. You either have an independent judiciary or you don't. And I sort of agree with him. So that makes it quite hard to see how Netanyahu does climb down from this, short of saying, not, we're going to put a softer proposal, but the time is not right. We're going to have to come back to this. Can he say that? Does he have the political space to say that with his coalition, with his public? Is that would he be too weakened by that? I don't know. In a way, I wouldn't blame protesters if they say, you know what, that's not our problem. That's his problem. But right now, for this to work, there needs to be a ladder by which he can climb down from the position he has staked out since this government was formed.
Right. The issue of compromise is, of course, the conversation of the week, of what we have seen thus far, is really proposals that are softening a little bit the original plan put forth presented by Yariv Levin. Look, I mean, obviously you can't go halfway, so that's a very complicated discussion to have. We know we've discussed this a lot on the podcast. The heart of this stage of the overhaul has to do with the fact that the coalition wanted 100% control over all of the judges, appointing all of the judges. This will not happen if there's a compromise. That's obvious. It's obvious it's one thing they need to compromise on. The other is what kind of judicial review will be in Israel. I mean, these are not small details. This is the heart of the matter. I don't see a plan yet, but it's important to also ask the question, you know what? There's an interesting thing that you do see in the Likud this week, because when the pilots came out with what they came out with, there were, of course, Netanyahu's loyalists in the Likud turning against the pilots themselves. This is unprecedented in Israeli history. You have people like Shlomo Kari, who's the Minister of Communications, telling them, go to hell. if you could ever imagine any Israeli politician telling Israeli pilots, combat pilots, go to hell, that is something we've never heard before. Another of his ministers, Galit Distal, another Netanyahu loyalist, telling them, I despise you. And then the Likud trying to pull this back. And other members of the Likud, people like Miki Zohar, people like Barkat. I'm saying these names because you asked me if there are any moderates or relative moderates in the Likud attacking their own members of Knesset, members of the government. So you see a little bit of these voices in the Likud saying, guys, we have to find a compromise. And not only in the Likud, also in the settler movement, there are voices that are saying, we need a compromise. So I think that is where this is heading. On the other side, there's a question, who's holding these negotiations? Because Lapid and Gantz can't sit on any or agree to anything that the protesters in the street won't agree to. The protesters in the street are not going to agree to, anything that looks to them that is too weak a compromise. Who are you talking to? The one person who could basically say, I agree with this compromise and everyone will listen to is maybe Aaron Barak, right? The venerated Chief Justice. That can be a way to get down from this ladder, but I think we're still a little bit far from that moment.
When you're getting into a culture war that involves you accusing some of your most vital military warriors of not being patriots and of saying that you despise them and you want them to go to hell, you are on the losing side. Just a closing thought on this. Why the pilots? What is there some thing that means the pilot, the Air Force traditionally more political? Why was it them who broke on this issue?
Well, I think, first of all, it wasn't only them. There's a whole line of elite units and reservists in elite units. Again, thousands of reservists signing these letters and saying, we're not going to take it. Like, I'm paraphrasing what they're saying, is essentially saying we fight for Israel and we will lay down our lives for Israel for the values that we recognize. If you turn into a country that we don't recognize, that contract is broken between us. That's essentially what they're saying, if I'm paraphrasing. But the point of what you're saying is the pilots got the most attention, obviously. First of all, because they get the most attention. They're the creme de la creme of the Israeli military, but also because, as I told you, this is not a theoretical, hypothetical scenario. In 10 years, Israel won't attack Iran and the country won't have pilots. No, it's right now in the cockpits every week. So that is why it's such an urgent thing to address.
As we said, so much news going on, but perhaps a bit of a turning point this week based on everything you've been saying. A week in which the Judaism traditionally commands that we see the world turned upside down. It sounds like politics in Israel has been a bit upside down anyway, but the festival of Purim this week, when everything is inverted and where those who are usually serious instead are sort of clownish. It's a strange kind of festival. Everyone's in costume. We had, the site here, I always mention this, of this very Haredi neighborhood I live in London, the one day a year when the kids get to really dress up in all the different costumes and so on. And obviously I know you are usually leading your kids through the neighborhood all dressed up. Did that happen again this year, Yoni?
Of course. Can I give my usual Purim rant, in which
Please.
In Israel, Purim is not, in diaspora, it's one day, I guess, of costumes. And in Israel, somehow it's morphed into this 7-day holiday. Apparently, the costumes lasted for 7 months. It was for 8 days. It was the miracle of Purim. Anyway, you have 3 kids. One would have 3 kids. And they all have to be, there are different costume days. So one is the official costume day. And then you have Animal Day and Pajama Day and Prince and Princess's Day and Hat Day. And it goes on. And of course, it's never coordinated. So every different school or kindergarten have their own decisions on when whoever comes. It's a difficult. I survived Purim should be my T-shirt this week.
That is unbelievably demanding.
But at least I like the fact that we stood with Jewish tradition and we have our Princess Elsa again this year. Very, very Jewishy, I think. Yes,
the Frozen Chosen.
The Frozen Chosen. I think my daughter is 5. I think she's been Elsa for Purim for 10 years straight. That's what it feels like. But yeah, so but still, there's nothing that I know that we've talked about this. You're more a Pesach person. I like Purim. What's not to like? You dress up and you get drunk. I like Purim. I like the story. Yep. I like the whole thing. But that kind of thing where this Tel Aviv neighborhood is suddenly, that magical moment of the little kids walking around in their ill-fit costumes and they're all so happy to be something else for a day. I mean, I love that moment. Anyway. And since it is Purim, we thought, why not pause for a minute and hear from someone who maybe if we laugh, we might feel better at this crazy time. So let's hear from someone who can make us laugh.
Our guest is a fixture in the New York comedy scene, voted one of the city's top 10 comedians by The Hollywood Reporter, regularly plays packed houses across the United States. He has fans absolutely everywhere, but especially, I think it's fair to say, among the American Jewish public. He was born in Tel Aviv. Newspaper profiles describe him as the Jewish, Orthodox, gay comedian, not always in that order. He is Mordechai Rosenfeld, better known as Modi. Modi, it is terrific to have you on Unholy. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here.
And fresh, I know, from a visit, very successful visit here in London, which went down extremely well, packed houses. And you're playing those everywhere you go. I mean, it seems to me that there you are in America, in the place that in some ways invented modern Jewish comedy. Everyone says American comedy is Jewish comedy, etc. But you seem to me to be perhaps the most Jewish comedian maybe there's ever been, because unlike, your Woody Allen and Larry David and so on, your act is about Jewish things. You even do a whole thing on how Jews say Good Yontif to each other, or Chag Sameach, depending. Are you the most Jewish comic ever? That's our first question.
I don't know that, but I'm definitely a Jewish comedian. There's comedians who happen to be Jewish, but I am a Jewish comedian, that's for sure.
But what I'm interested in, the New York Jewish comedy scene, is quite crowded, if not the most crowded. It's not like you wanted to be a German comedian in Munich, right? It's a tough thing to do. It really is. Did you kind of think of that, or it just came naturally to you that you knew you'd be good?
I didn't think about I think about how hard it would be or how hard it is to do it. It was a kind of like it just happened very naturally. My friend who I used to imitate the secretaries that I worked with. So my friend said, you should do this instead of at the table, do it on stage. So he organized a comedy night where people were brought in, and I went up and I just did all the imitations I did for all my friends, and they just loved it. It was these over the top characters of people I worked with, all types of accents, and just the crazy little things, and that's how it began.
And I'm just interested whether the comedy professionals, as it were, like agents, for example, or people booking, set what they made of, because there is a perennial reaction to this, which I want to run past you, which is when you said, where they saw that part of your act is, for example, the difference between the way Ashkenazi Jews bless the bread, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, and the way Sephardi or Mizrahi Jews do that. Did anybody say, you know what, this is too Jewish? Those two words, too Jewish. Did you ever get that?
Well, when I began doing comedy, it wasn't as Jewish. My voice developed as a Jewish voice, but at first it was just these over-the-top characters, these accents, these different language imitations, gibberish, but fun. The Jewish voice began a little bit later on, and then it was just such a part of me. What am I going to take, classes to change my accent and go out for roles as a surfer boy? This is what it is.
So that people get just even a flavor of the kind of material we're talking about here, just unpack for us this difference between the Sabbath greeting across the Jewish world, just because I think it's quite illustrative of the sort of thing you're doing.
I don't know this. So this is, I guess, something that's stuck in your head and you couldn't wait to get this going on your podcast.
I couldn't wait.
Yeah, give me a good Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom. Peaceful Shabbat Shalom. They give it to you with all they're from here. Shabbat Shalom. They almost command you to have a peaceful Sabbath. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Aleichem ve'al kol b'nechem. U'me'al kol b'nei v'nehem. Shabbat Shalom. They give it to you. It's passion. Ashkenazi Jews before the Sabbath. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos. How are you? Okay, good.
With your arms folded, like as if you're a very clenched, uptight Ashkenazi Jew.
Yes.
What would you know about that, Jonathan? About being anyway. I was just wondering, since you do, I mean, one of your really the talents is to do every Jewish denomination. Like you do the Reforms, you do the Hasidim, ultra Orthodox. Like you can play any crowd. I wonder, without getting you into too much trouble, which is the best crowd for comedy out of all of the Jewish denominations? You're not going to answer that, are you?
It's the situation.
Okay.
We were in London. I had 5 shows. Each show is different. The 7 o'clock shows were a little bit better than some of the 9:30 shows because people were less tired. The British people, we realized, because I like to put a little bit of light on the audience just so I can see them. And the British, you got to turn all the lights off because they don't want to laugh in front of other people. We learned that in the first night of shows. I perform in events where it's not just comedy happening that night. There's a dinner, a gala, there's speakers, there's honorees, there's a movie about the organization, and Here's Modi, which is the name of my podcast. That's why I named my podcast And Here's Modi, because I'm always following something crazy. It's not just a comedy night. So it depends on the situation of the audience.
Mm-hmm. And I notice that you must get this a lot. There is a kind of gasp of recognition that your material brings from your audience. And where I first felt it, saw it, was the character of yours that I think went viral during lockdown, which is Yoli. Maybe you'll say it differently. But the sort of Haredi, Hasidic Jew, which is just such a brilliant idea. Reviewing Yoli, thank you. Reviewing, ultra secular TV, Tiger King or The Crown or whatever. And that went viral. But what was really interesting, I noticed when people shared it with me, they'd immediately say, obviously this guy is from the Haredi world. Nobody else could do this otherwise. So, it must be somebody who has been in that world. Is he still in that world? That was the conversation. Nobody could believe you'd made it up, basically. So what are you drawing from? Where did that come from? And even this collision of him, watching Tiger King. I mean, which part of your brain did all that come from?
I don't know. I'm very good at accents. I'm very good at picking up things when I'm around them. And I've been around the Hasidic world, so I pick up their nuances that are amazing. They're so great. And, during lockdown, they were getting such a bad rap between not quarantining, which they almost couldn't. You can't quarantine when you have 18 kids in the house, And then all the movies that came out, Unorthodox and My Unorthodox Life, and all these just horrendously awful, negative showing of this community. So I said, I'm going to come on and we're going to have fun with it. Here's Yoli, here's the character, here's what's happening. I made some PSA announcements regarding the mask. I made some, for Hatzalah, for the ambulance corps. I don't remember the videos, but then we did I gave a heter. I gave them reshus to watch television. And then the near character, which is much, more along my line, which is the Israeli know-it-all. Listen to me, we were quarantining. We made the best of it. With Yoli, we ran for president in 2020. We did all kinds of reviews and videos, and to a point where it became when people weren't sure I was a comedian. People who hadn't heard of me didn't know that he's also a comedian. They just thought there was these characters.
Whoa.
That's what I mean. People bought it. And did the Haredi community, did they like Yoli or
They
not?
loved it. But funny enough, the Haredi community liked Nir more, and the Israeli community liked Yoli more. Because they can. I work with a Yoli or I work with a Nir. Everybody found who they liked
themselves. Talk to us a little bit about growing up with Israeli parents. You lived in Israel until the age of 7. Talk to us. Essentially living in an Israeli household in Long Island, basically growing up? We
came to America at the age of 7. I was at the age of 7. I came with my parents because that was the only option I had. Not that I regret it. It was amazing and I'm happy. And we grew up in Long Island, and growing up with Israeli parents, is... growing up with any parents that are foreign, that they're coming with their cultures and all of that. we lived in the 5 towns, and my parents were trying to figure out where we were going to be, like, what was their jam, what was going to be their. We tried to go into the Catskills once. We left in the middle. My mom was so grossed out by the food. My parents ended up being friends with other Israelis, and that was in the house we only spoke Hebrew. So that was the growing up, and you grow up with an Israeli mom. It's just different than growing up with a regular mom in the 5 towns.
So you gave this interview with Variety recently, and it got a lot of attention. I think people misreported it as if it was some kind of coming out statement. You later clarified, no, it wasn't. People knew exactly who you were before then. But these are your words to Variety. I think if people were to describe me, it's like this. This is a proud Jewish comedian. He's gay. He keeps kosher. He puts on tefillin. He goes to Shabbat services, but he's also gay. So, I'm thinking particularly of the kind of crowds you play for, often Orthodox crowds, even ultra-Orthodox crowds, maybe you'll tell us. Are they as comfortable with that description of you and that reality as you are?
Yes. So far we haven't. The phone, thank God, Baruch Hashem, keeps ringing nonstop. Every day we get somewhere around 5 inquiries for shows. From Orthodox Jewish events to Chabad, to Bonei Olam, to Shaarei Tzedek, to Chai Lifeline, and my own shows too, where I sell out, and it's people come in there with yarmulkes. So I don't think it has any impact where it's preventing me growing as a comedian or will take away work. And anybody that doesn't want to hire me because I'm gay, I don't want to be there. That's like a gig I'm okay not doing.
And I suppose what's behind that is there was a time where those two, categories were seen as mutually exclusive. Orthodox Jewish was one thing, gay was another thing. The minute an Orthodox Jew said they were gay, it was assumed that means they're breaking from Orthodoxy. They're no longer going to be accepted in that world. They'll break from it. I know, from experience, the community I'm in here, those were seen as two sort of binary categories. You seem to have bucked that. Has something changed where it is completely acceptable within the Orthodox world for a gay man to be a gay man, and Orthodox Jews are now fine with that?
I think the world has changed a lot. Not just the Orthodox world, but the whole world. In fact, just the way they view gay people. When I was growing up, I didn't know that gay was also the senator and your doctor and your lawyer. It was, we didn't know. Today, it's someone who's coming out and knows that they have every option in the world that they can be and do. And so the world and the Orthodox Jewish community is embracing it. Also, it's also how close it's your child comes out to you. Do you want to lose this child, or do you want to still have them in your life? And people, I think have just developed in general. There are people who are still way back and are a mess, but I think in general it's become a lot better.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk about the Jewish part of your personality and say, this is not at all a funny issue, and that is the issue of anti-Semitism. When you live in a country that has Kanye West and Joe Rogan saying things like that Jews love money like Italians love pizza, how do you deal with that? Is humor the answer to everything, or is there more?
I use it to my humor is the answer through me. As my job as a comedian, humor is the answer to bringing happiness to sad people and bringing peace wherever you can. And things such as Kanye, for me, was a blessing that he screamed all of that stuff out. I put it in my act. There was places where it actually helped me with a punchline. It unites people when we laugh. What
was the punchline?
What?
What was the punchline?
The punchline is where those 23andMe, that test that gives you your ancestry, they also give you your what are your health risks.
And the results came back, and they were amazing for them. Got back those pie charts. 1/8 Navajo Indian. Woo! A quarter Iberian, Celtic, Norwegian, African. I was so excited. I opened mine up. It said 99.8% Jewish. That was it. The pie chart was a matzah ball with a toothpick in it. The results came back in Yiddish. Then they give you your health risks. What are my health risks? Is it hypertension? Is it diabetes? Nazis! Nazis are my number one. Nazis and Kanye are my number one health risks.
Contribution for his.
So you're unusual a bit because, like this podcast, you straddle the two Jewish worlds, meaning Israel and not Israel, the diaspora Jewish world, America and so on, performed here in Britain and Europe. What are the big differences as a comic in front of those audiences? Are there jokes that Israelis roar with laughter at that just would fall flat to an American Jewish audience? And does it work the other way around? I mean, people used to say that, Israelis would sit watching old Woody Allen movies and think, well, why is this funny? This guy, this sort of schlemiel is, he's not big and strong like we are. I don't get the joke. That was what used to be the sort of cliche. They did used to say that. Yonit, you're an exception because, of course, you love those movies. But you know what I mean. Are there jokes that work or don't work?
The jokes are, the jokes work, to answer your question. In both audiences, you have to know your audience. You have to know how to deliver the joke, how to present the joke. Again, like I said, I make fun of Ashkenazi people because I'm Ashkenazi. I can't go up there and say, Sephardi people are ridiculous. They take so long to do everything. You can't do that because it doesn't, if you're making fun of yourself, okay. And then they understand, I'm just making fun of the fact that there's differences, but what does it mean? It means nothing. It doesn't mean anything. It's just funny. View it as funny, not as a real difference and a problem that we have to change. They all have to start saying Shabbat Shalom. They can't say Good Shabbos. It's not. It's comedy. It brings levity, and people always, my wife is Ashkenazi, my husband's Sephardic, this one's Israeli, that one's Hasidic. It unites people. And regarding your Israeli and American art, it's how you present the joke. It's all how you present the joke. If you want to quote Woody Allen, he said there could be a joke that's not funny at all. And somebody funny says it, it'll be funny. There's a joke that's funny, a hysterical joke. Someone who's not funny says it, it won't land. So it's what it is.
I am not going to drag you into the Israeli quagmire and ask you what do you think about what's going on here, unless you want to say it. But I'm wondering, since a Jewish comedian is doing a pretty good job in saving Ukraine, maybe you'd like to come over and help us out. I'm just saying.
I help out every day when I just make people laugh. I know what's happening in Israel is absolutely insane. And hopefully it's something that brings to a better end. I don't know the bits and the little who's who and what said that and this Sar and that Sar and all of the ministers. I don't follow any of that. I just send my prayers. I hope that I make people laugh somewhere, that it brings that energy into Israel. I'm going to be performing in Israel. I hope that brings a little bit of, and there's some TV projects I'm working on with Israel that are happening. So, but yeah, as far as what's happening politically in Israel, I just wish for Mashiach energy. I just hope that whatever comes out of this, that whatever you're going through brings a great result.
Yeah, I love this phrase, Mashiach energy. You use it in your stand-up act. I think, there's a little bit of Chabad in there, a bit with the whole, the Rebbe before and that, the thought that maybe he was the Messiah, etc. What's your meaning when you talk about Mashiach energy?
Mashiach energy, the easiest thing to understand from it is laughter. It's laughter. You're in a room with people and they're laughing. You're all one. You're all doing the same thing. You're laughing. You're having an amazing body experience, and just try to get that to be everywhere. When you help people, which is the Rebbe, he was all about helping people. As soon as you met him, you got to be in front of him. He gave you $1 to go help somebody else. This is Mashiach energy. The Rebbe was the complete embodiment of Mashiach energy.
Not a barrel of laughs, though.
Huh?
Not a barrel of laughs, though.
I don't know. I never hung out with him. I bet you he was very funny. I never sat with him for Yechidus. I never sat with him and one-on-one. I've only received dollars, but I'm sure people in his circle, when he could drop a joke, he would drop a joke, because laughter, again, is Mashiach energy, and that's what he was.
What's your favorite Yiddish word? Ours is verklempt. Can I say that ours is verklempt, or do you have a different one, Jonathan?
No, I'm prepared to accept that view. I mean, there's
verklempt
plenty I like. I could offer more, but let's hear our guest's nomination.
There's no way I have a favorite Yiddish word. There is, in whatever situation I'm in, there might be a favorite word for that. Do you understand?
Okay.
Yep. I'm watching a video of mine and we see the angle was bad. I'm like, wow, I look so verharget. Oh, I look awful. I'm watching a video of mine. I'm dressed. I look gepatched, New Jersey. It's like there's no favorite. Yiddish it's whatever word comes up to you, whatever word comes.
But is it all from your grandparents? I mean, you speak your Yiddish is fluent. If there is such a
we had
thing to
our
say.
grandparents did speak Yiddish. I listened to Yiddish music all growing up. And then when I was in yeshiva and I studied the sichot, the sichos of the Rebbe, that was my favorite thing. And I would study that in Yiddish, and that's where I picked up the Yiddish. And then you work it, and you listen to stuff, and you watch, and it builds, and you learn Yiddish. Like someone who's imprisoned in a jail in Mexico, they're going to learn Spanish.
It's very, very similar experience, I think. Very similar experience. A Jewish upbringing is very akin to a Mexican experience of incarceration. But let's just ask you this. The different festivals, some are funny, some are not funny, I'm guessing. But Purim claims to be like the fun festival. People dress up and so on. There's meant to be laughter. Is Purim funny? This is the week of Purim. Is it funny?
It's fun. I've done many shows on Purim. People love it's a fun holiday. It's one of the fun ones. I don't know if it's funny, but it's fun.
Yeah. So what is your favorite Jewish holiday then?
Wow. My favorite Jewish holiday is Yom Kippur is definitely up there. Hanukkah.
Hanukkah's good.
It's 8 days. You can plan 8 events. There's no telephone restriction. You can drive. You can call. Hanukkah is definitely one of my favorites.
We agree. Jonathan's a Pesach person.
I love Pesach, but I think all of them have got a case. I wonder about humor, though. I'm just wondering if it's one of the ones that isn't meant to be fun, ends up with more potential for humor. In other words, there are a lot of old jokes, aren't there? Hasidic sort of Chelm jokes about Yom Kippur, for example.
Right.
The man with the food stashed in his pockets. It seems to me there's more potential for jokes in the festivals that aren't meant to be funny.
There's jokes in everything. Come on. Every time you go to synagogue on Yom Kippur, some idiot says, I'm sponsoring Kiddush. There's always the jokes. You know what I'm saying? It's always, people find a joke and they can do it. You should always look for the joke. And it doesn't matter what holiday it is. It could even be Tisha B'Av, you always find some kind of humor. I have a whole bit I do about a Shiva. I do a whole thing on a Shiva, death, and you make it funny. You bring humor to it.
I've seen your gag about the speed of a Jewish funeral, because Jews do it quick, right? The funeral. There's no messing around.
Shivas. Do you know what Shivas? Non-Jews, I'm not going to lose you. Shivas is when Jews die. When a Jew dies, we bury them right away. Right? There's no messing around. Someone died, bam, in the ground. There is no messing around. In Florida, when the old people take a nap, they wake up, no! Put the shovel away, it's just a nap!
Especially in England, I was talking about how long it took for them to bury the Queen. They dragged her for 23 days, and I did a whole thing on that, and they were cracking up. England is it's a unique audience, the Jews in England. They were first of all, I didn't know there was only 300,000.
At most, yeah. I mean, it's maybe 270,000. It's not a big community, but we make ourselves noticed.
So almost 3,000 came to my show.
Yeah.
So that's 10%, no?
I think that's 1%. 1%. But I don't want to quibble with you. Who needs to talk numbers on a day like this?
Thank God I left Merrill Lynch.
2 Jews talking percentages. It's not a good look.
So talk to us more about the British Jewish crowd. It's okay. We can accept
Yonit
that.
likes this. Anything negative,
I like it.
she's going to lap it up.
No negative.
Love
no
it.
negative.
They are so sweet, and all the shows began on time. I was in shock. When we do shows in New York, we just assume 20, 30 minutes late. Maybe I tell the opening actors to do half of his stuff. They were great. They came to laugh. They were watching more than they were like, where's this going? They were wonderful. They came, they bought tickets right away. The show sold out immediately. It was fun being in England. And it wasn't in the Jewish community. There was an effort made for them to come to the show. It wasn't like in Golders Green, you park by the synagogue, you go upstairs. It was fun. And, the whole English audience, I really only met them during the pandemic, during quarantine, when I began doing shows out there and online, on Zoom. And then they just keep in touch on very polite. We enjoyed your show very much. Brilliant, absolutely lovely, very, very sweet audience.
That's good to hear. Of course, if it had been in Golders Green, they wouldn't have parked outside. They would have double parked outside. That's very important in Golders Green. Modi, it's been a great pleasure. You have seen the Purim week in for us in great style.
Yeah.
But I know you have a website people can look up to find out where you're next performing.
ModiLive.com, all the tickets, ModiLive.com. Sign up for the email list and put down where you are so you won't get emails for shows that have nothing to do with you. And and Here's Modi is my podcast, which is a lot of fun. And people enjoy it probably as much as they enjoy yours. And I hope we made this holy rather than unholy. And and I wish you guys an amazing Purim, an amazing Pesach, and just fun and lots of Mashiach energy.
Thanks a lot, Modi.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we are very grateful to Modi, keeping us smiling in these potentially unsmiling times. We have our own little contribution to the Joy of Nations with our weekly awards, Yonit, and I think there is a very worthy nominee. Although much competition this time, but
crowded field this week, indeed. But we return to the issue of the pilots who refused service. Netanyahu, of course, coming out talking against this phenomenon in a press op, which he did in the backdrop were border police, and he wanted to talk against the phenomenon of refusal, of insubordination. He was standing next to Itamar Ben-Gvir, who in other times in Israel was a symbol of insubordination and of not following the rules. And they both were talking about how important it is to follow the rules and do what you are told and not to refuse. So I think that's a little bit of a chutzpah award, really.
It is a perfect chutzpah award that Itamar Ben-Gvir is lecturing soldiers, patriots, on their obligations to obey the state when, do you remember Ruth Margalit on our podcast said that when he appeared at some court hearing and they wanted to print up the history of past convictions, there were so many they had to change the ink on the printer to print up the full historic sort of rap sheet against Itamar Ben-Gvir. Mm-hmm. And he's now telling Israeli Air Force pilots about obeying the rules. Unbelievable chutzpah, just perfect. For Mensch, before we get to our Mensch, I just wanted to give a little mention of somebody who could have been a candidate for Mensch in recent weeks for his contribution to the field of Israeli archaeology. And I say could because of the way things turned out. But Eylon Levy, who is a spokesperson for the president of the state of Israel, was out walking during a hike in the Tel Aviv National Park, where he came across a tiny bit of pottery, a pottery fragment which appeared to say on it, in Aramaic, the inscription year 24 of Darius or Darius, depending on how you pronounce it, which would have dated this little item, this pottery fragment, to 498 BCE. Everyone got very excited. He handed over to the Israel's Antiquities Authority. People were thinking this is the first proof of the presence of this figure, the father of the biblical Ahasuerus or Achashverosh, big figure in the Purim story. Everything was coming together perfectly until, as if to spoil the party, Israel's Antiquities Authority had to step forward and say, I'm afraid it's a fake. And not a malicious fake, we should stress, but rather somebody, a scholar, an unnamed expert, had been on an expedition in Tel Aviv last summer. And in order to demonstrate to students how these artifacts used to be inscribed, she had got out some kind of, a little blade or a pencil or something, and she'd written Darius, the year 24, on the scrap of pottery and threw it to the ground, only for it to be found by Elon Levy. But Elon Levy did the right thing by handing it to the Antiquities Authority, and for a few days enjoyed the status of this great archaeological trailblazer. This story went right round the world. In the end, unfortunately, a false alarm, but a mention for Elon Levy at least for doing the right thing.
Can't believe you did this whole Purim thing without saying Xerxes once.
Well, I of course wouldn't have said that because I think the figure you're referring to is Xerxes. And I think that's how we say that, isn't it? Scholars, please do correct either me or Yonit for this.
First of all, scholars, please reprimand Jonathan for being condescending, and then agree with me that it's Xerxes and not Xerxes.
Oh, very
so
nice.
Obvious.
I'm sure that between us, we've hit the right pronunciation at least once. I'm not saying when, and I'm not saying who, but for me, I say Xerxes. You say, what is it? How do you say it?
Xerxes.
So I think Xerxes. I think the X when it's the first letter is like a Z. That's where I'm going.
Wait, but we had an actual. Oh yes, we do have an actual mensch,
Yes,
obviously,
we do.
which we should reiterate. That was what we opened with. So
It is.
Chaim
I
Topol
think
can't be. No other person can be the mensch of the week.
Topol is our mensch of the week, and a bringer of much joy over many, many years. A memory just pops back into my head. He did a series for the BBC in the 80s called Topol's Israel, where he did this little guide with his daughter and everything, went around various places. An interesting sign of how times have changed. I don't think the BBC would air such a show now, but as Tevye, he will be forever remembered, even if that was a burden for him a little bit in his lifetime. He has left his mark, and so Chaim Topol, our mensch of the week. We will see you all next week. If you've enjoyed the show, remember to rate and review. I looked at our little ratings the other day. We are at 4.9 out of 5 stars. It is
My mother would say to that, why only 4.9?
Why only 4.9? We're happy. We'll take the win. We're very grateful to you for doing that. We're pleased. Do spread the word. Remember, we're on Facebook and Instagram at Unholy Podcast, and we should say thank you
to Gaia Glazer, Rom Atik, Omer Primat, and Yair Bashan. Happy what's left of Purim, and we shall meet next week.
We shall. See you then.
See ya.
This podcast is brought to you by Cyber attacks can be prevented. Checkpoint. You deserve the best security.